Hey folks, Dr. Dave here. We're going to be learning how to use Ableton Live, creating drum racks with nested instrument racks. This is project 2 for the Computer Music Applications 161 class. We're basically going to be creating a drum rack within Ableton Live. We're going to be nesting instrument racks within different paths of that drum rack, which allows us to layer samples and process samples. This can be done through adding device inserts and chaining together devices on one sample or the group of samples or the entire drum rack. And it also gives us the capabilities of using effect sends within the drum rack. So basically all the post-production work you would do to processing drums, but all within the drum rack itself. So it's pretty awesome. Okay, so here we go. Go ahead and open up Ableton Live. We got a fresh session here. Now the first thing you want to do every time you open up a session is probably save it and give it a name. So we're going to go up to File, Save the Live Set As, and we're going to name this something to do with our project that we're working on. My name scheme I always use for my classes are first and last name, underscore, the course number. So this is 161, whichever class that is, and then the project title. So this is project 2. Okay, so you can always save stuff to the desktop and then move this around later to a folder or an external drive. All right, so we've got our project now titled up here. What we're doing today is building drum racks and using the nested instrument rack technique so that we can layer samples and do processing to our audio samples. So with this project, we are required to create 3 different drum sounds. So kick drum, a snare, and a hi-hat. So drum racks are found inside of the instrument category. And if you look up here, you see the drum rack. You want to grab the drum rack and you can drag that on top of a MIDI track and it will open up your drum rack down here in the bottom. This is called your device chain. This is the view of the devices that you have stringed together. So we trigger the different drum pads and different drum sounds that are on these different blocks with different notes on the keyboard. So I got C, D, and I'm going to use E. Keep it simple. So it's going to be kick drum on C1, D1 is going to be the snare drum, and then E1 is going to be my hi-hat. These are the various octaves of your keyboard. I'm going to be using the C1 octave 1. So here we go. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to grab instrument racks from the instruments category and we're going to drop these onto each of the pads that we're going to use for our different drum sounds. So I put one drum instrument rack on the C1 pad. I'm going to take another instrument rack and drop that onto the D1 pad. And then I'm going to grab another instrument rack and put that on my E1. All right. So I've got instrument racks now nested within these drum pads or notes of the keyboard. And I now want to rename these so I know what the heck they're going to be. So my C1 was going to be my kick drum. So if I highlight anything in Ableton Live and go Command R, it brings up my ability to enter a name. So I'm going to call that kick. I'm going to click on the D, Command R to rename, and we're going to call that the snare. And then hi-hat. I'm going to do a closed hi-hat here on the next pad. Command R, and it's going to be hi-hat closed. Okay, great. So the next thing we want to do is search around and find some samples. Samples, drum samples and different loops and sounds are going to be found under the samples category. And your browser in Ableton a lot of times has a lot of files in it. So what you have to do to narrow down your search is use the search bar to search for kick drums. Okay, so I have all these different kick drum sounds. I click on them, I can sample them and listen to them. Basically what I'm going for here is I'm trying to find 3 different sounds that are 3 different characteristics of a kick drum. So for me, I think about like a realistic drum room sound, like a a big old kick drum in a room with the reverberation. That's one element. I think about the really bitey attack of the beater, so a really bright sounding sample for the kick, and then something that's got some sub frequency, some low end in it. So this is your drum rack right here. This is your instrument rack. These devices are chained together. This instrument rack is within this pad of the drum rack. So I have different views on each of my devices down here. I have the on the instrument rack, there is a button right here which shows the like the sample view, or the chain view of the objects inside this once I put some in there. There's the chain list view, which is almost like a little Finder browser list of the items that I have within the instrument rack. So this is where I'm going to see all my different drum samples. Over here on the drum rack, we have the same thing. We have the macro, which we're not using. We have the show and hide chain list. So it's probably a good idea just to expand the chain lists on both the drum rack and the instrument rack so you can see everything. Okay, so as you can see, I've got my samples right here. I've got the list of samples right here, and then within each of these, I'm going to have a list of drum samples that layer together and build up each of these different kick drum, snare drum, and hi-hats. So I find 3 different kicks. I drag them onto the instrument rack, either here or there, doesn't matter. They're gonna show up either way. So, okay, now that I have my kick drum sample here, I can fire off this layer of samples with my keyboard. All right, sweet. So at this point, what I like to do is mix these sounds together. You can solo each of these sounds individually, as well as pan them or change the dynamics, change the volume. So this is a fader right here. To do this, what I'd like to do is individually listen to each of these. So I'm going to solo each kick sound and play it. There's my beater. There's my room. There's my sub aspect. And when I listen to all 3 of them together, hear a lot of that ringing of the room. A little bit too much, especially if I want to add my own reverb. So what I'm going to do is find that room sound. And over here in the sample display, I can edit the sample. So I can change the ending of the sample. I can mess with the envelope of the sample. So over here we have attack, decay, sustain, release. We can make the sound sustain less and release a little bit quicker. So we get a little bit less of that reverby room sound that I'm going to add later with reverb. That's a little bit better. Okay, that's a little bit brighter. I've got a lot of that beater sound in there, so I'm going to turn that down. So basically at this point I can craft my kick drum by changing the different levels and the balance between these 3 samples, and I can also mess with the sample waveform itself. So it's always a good idea to zoom way in on these samples and look and see what's going on with the phasing. So if you're going to be playing 3 drum samples at the same time, you want to make sure that they're in phase and they line up nicely. So if you zoom in, you can see that this wave is going positive first. If I go to the next one and zoom in, I can see that this wave is going negative first. So that's out of phase from the other one. I can adjust the beginning of the sample so that it lines up. That's positive, that's positive. Let's see what this other one does. I zoom way in, and once again, we're going positive. Okay, great. So our waves look good. It sounds good. I'm happy with that. And I can go ahead and move on to the next. So I have my drum rack here with the nested instrument racks that have been renamed. Inside of each of these instrument racks that show up here within the drum rack chain list, I have a layering of 3 different sounds. The next thing I might want to do is add effects like reverb or distortion to some of these sounds via a send and return. You can do all this within the drum rack. So over here on the left side of the drum rack, when I have the chain list exposed, it also shows the return and sends. views. So with the show and hide chain list button engaged, I can also choose to show the sends and returns. We'll be using these for audio effects. Okay, so once I show these sends and returns, I see this new window pop up here, and this says drop audio effects here. So I can go up and I find audio effects that I might want to use. I'm going to use a reverb. So I'll grab the reverb, and I'm going to drag that audio effect down here onto the drum rack. Okay, now what happens once I do that is I see the reverb show up as a device, and it's been assigned a letter which corresponds to the send. Now, the send column here just appeared, and on each of the kick, snare, and hi-hat sounds, I now have the ability to send a portion of that sound into the reverb. So when I hit the hi-hat now, I can choose to add a various amount of reverb via a send and return. So if I click on the reverb device down here, it's going to show me the reverb plugin to the right. So let's see, we have an overdrive audio effect. I'm going to drag that onto this effects window here, and it adds once again a new send column in for each of the drum samples. All right, so we've got your drum pads over here. We've got the chain list of your different drum sounds. Below it, we have the device chain list of your reverb and overdrive effects that you had just dragged and dropped onto the drum rack. So I, at this point, do a little bit of mixing, and I want to add some of these reverb and overdrive effects to my snare drum. Starting to hear the reverb kick in there on the snare. Sounds good. Maybe a little bit of bite I can add to the sound by turning up the send on the overdrive. It makes it louder too, so I might have to manage that. Very loud snare. Now the snare itself seems to be louder than the other sounds. So one thing I might do is turn down the volume of the snare so that it balances better with the rest of the drum kit. Pretty good balance there amongst my drums. All right, so first thing is to set the metronome on. I can turn on the metronome by activating it here. Now I see it's yellow or orange or whatever. That's the metronome on and off. I also need to give myself a count in. I'm going to give myself 1 bar of count in, which means the metronome is going to go for 4 beats. And what I'm going to do here now is record the drum part, a drum beat, into the first clip slot. So I need to make sure that my track is armed and I'm getting sound, and I can go ahead and press the record button right here on the clip to record a drum beat. Great. So I might continue to create other drum beats in other clips. The requirement of this assignment is to have 2 different sections, so 2 different drum beats, and then you can layer instruments on top of those 2 different beats. So I might duplicate this and then create another beat that's similar, or maybe more simplistic or more complex. I can duplicate or copy and paste these clips anywhere. So I'm just going to select this one, Command D duplicates it, Command D once again, and that comes down to the next clip slot. Now, next thing is to add other instruments. If you're working with MIDI, you can create new MIDI tracks by pressing Command Shift T. That will create a new MIDI track. And you can put bass and synth and piano or whatever else you want on these sounds.